working as a senior journalist at the Catholic Weekly here in Sydney, and most obviously long edited Mercator as an online journal, which he's going to talk about today. But he did his undergraduate studies in the United States in English and American literature, and then moved to Australia to do a master's degree. And he began a career in journalism with a cadetship at the Sydney Morning Herald, then moved into university administration. He was a brave man. And publishing before launching BioEdge, an international bioethics newsletter in 2001. And it was in 2005 that he and a New Zealand journalist, Carolyn Moynihan, started Mercator, later called simply Mercator. As for extracurricular interests, Michael tells me he is fond of bushwalking, black coffee, and dare I say it, bad puns. So please join me in welcoming Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Carl. I put up this quote from Chesterton, which sort of sums up the journalistic experience, I think, of my journalistic experience, because most of it editing Mercator was on opinion pieces, basically editorials, op-eds. So the writer of leading articles, the writer of our fact is known for 20 minutes as though he studied it for 20 years. So I have plenty of experience of that. So anyway, well, if I is that better? Yes. Okay. Good. Well, if I had to choose between public speaking and root canal therapy, I'd have to be hard-pressed to choose. But Carl was so gracious in his invitation to speak about Mercator, or its original name, Mercator.net, the online magazine I edited for about 20 years, until early this year. I had to accept, but I wondered why I had been invited. And initially I surmised that Carl was besotted with my sparkling prose. Every bit as good as Chesterton, perhaps. But then I realised that the only thing that Chesterton and I had in common was this. We both edited idealistic magazines which sputtered upward, glided for a while, and then crashed. So perhaps I can start with Chesterton. So this is as a journalist, he actually edited the GK's Weekly, and he was the most prominent of the contributors. And serendipitously, I think amongst the centenaries that Carl mentioned, he launched this in 1925. So this is the centenary of GK's Weekly. And it was published between 1925 and 1936, the year of his death. Auberon Waugh, who was a British critic and novelist, son of Evelyn Waugh, commented rather sharply, says, many magazines have been founded to support a political movement, but only one political movement, so far as I know, has ever been launched to support a magazine. I'm not quite sure if that's right, but this political movement was, of course, distributism. And this is what the magazine looked like. This is from the year, I think this is an issue of March 1936, and the last issue that he edited was in July. So I don't know if you've been involved in some sort of journalism for a while, you'll recognize the awkward typography and black slabs of black print and so on. But it had a great life because of its contributors. I mean, the main attraction, of course, was Chesterton himself, but he had a stellar Rolodex, as it were. It featured luminaries like Ronald Knox, Maurice Baring, E.C. Bentley, Those are sort of forgotten names now, but they were popular, very popular at the time. Eric Gill, Hilaire Belloc, Arnold Lunn, Christopher Dawson. Ezra Pound contributed his poem Usurer, which is one of my favorite poems, by at least of that kind of era. And I was very surprised to discover that he published it in GK's Weekly. George Bernard Shaw. And a fun fact, Eric Blair, better known nowadays as George Orwell, published his first essay in GK's Weekly. But it was always difficult to stem the flow of red ink. Chesterton did not have a great head for business. Circulation stagnated, and after his death in 1936, loyal fans kept it afloat, but as the Weekly Review until 1948. So, Mercator, our subtext was a compass for common sense, and you can. It's still online. We'll keep it up there as a sort of archive for a while. Actually, I'll just show you what it looks like at the moment. Let's see. Oops, it is. How do we do this? Yeah. So that's, we're closed, but a few things. So I think it looked pretty smart, I think, but yeah, all good things had to come to an end, and so we're closed. But you can still access it for another 3 years or so. Well, like Chesterton, we didn't have a good head for business either, so it's another thing that we had in common. We started Mercator in 2005 without a serious business plan or marketing plan or contributors. I say we because the deputy editor, as Carl said, was Carolyn Moynihan, a wonderful journalist in Auckland. She was always a pleasure to work with, and I always like to mention her because she was at least half of the enterprise. So we had a bit of seed money to cover basic costs. Some friends of mine created a website for us. It was extraordinarily ugly. And I started spamming people to start a mailing list. I bullied some friends into contributing, and bit by bit we grew. The website became more attractive. I was pretty happy with that. The name, so that's Gerhardus Mercator. So he was a great Renaissance cartographer. He created the Mercator projection. Now, when I was in school, one of the things we were taught in geography, or the only thing I can remember from geography, in fact, is the Mercator projection, which cast a round spherical world onto a flat map. So there's a lot of distortion at the globe, at the top. So Greenland looks as though it's bigger than Africa, and so on. And I thought everybody knew about it. This turns out to be quite wrong. Nobody had ever heard of them. I spent the next 20 years explaining who he was. But we were stuck with it, and the net suffix was a sort of nod to the internet, which at the time I thought it was pretty cool. If you go to YouTube and Google Mercator projection, there's you'll get a snippet from an old West Wing episode in which devotees of a different type of projection are introduced to the staff of the White House. It's quite hilarious, and they say that the Mercator projection is completely outdated. So anyway, have a look. But Mercator was a sort of emblem for our philosophy. So Mercator's life and work are metaphors for what we aspire to: craftsmanship, setting accurate courses, opening up new worlds, and venturing upon stormy, uncharted seas. His maps were accurate in the center and distorted at either side. A good image of Mercator's editorial policy of balance and accuracy. Well, in retrospect, that sounds a bit hubristic, but we did try to avoid the polarization which suffused public debate in recent years. I think people appreciated that. I tried not to be too combative in language anyway, except for a few people. So Chesterton was no fan of the mainstream media. He observed that press barons never forget their one great duty to the public: to prevent anything of any importance becoming public. So this is a wild exaggeration, of course, but it does contain a great truth, that the miraculous and magnificent thing about life is that order and goodness do exist. So this is another quote from Chesterton on journalism: "Busy editors cannot be expected to put on their posters, 'Mr. Wilkinson still safe,' or 'Mr. Jones of Worthing not dead yet.' They cannot announce the happiness of mankind. They cannot describe all the forks that are not stolen, the marriages that are not judiciously dissolved." Which is which there's a difficulty if you are a journalist. You might realize that some things are terribly important, but there's no action there. I remember when I worked very, very briefly at the Sydney Morning Herald, and I remember one of the journalists telling me about a contest the sub-editors once had, which was to write the world's most boring headline. And someone came up with the headline is "Small earthquake in Peru, no one injured."
That was Margaret.
That's Margaret, is it? Yeah. You need to have something which draws people in. If it bleeds, it leads. That's the slogan that all journalists remember. And I think it's quite important. For instance, one of the things that we did well, I think at Mercator was demography. Well, nowadays, I think the message still hasn't got through to the mainstream media, to the politicians, pundits, and so on. And you will find people rabbiting on still about overpopulation, and especially in the context of climate change. But there's a disaster approaching us. There's a demographic winter with nearly every country in the world outside of sub-Saharan Africa and Israel falling below replacement level. This is going to lead to a huge overhang of elderly being cared for by a shrinking number of young people, young workers. This is going to transform economies. It's going to upset the geopolitical order. It probably lead to gigantic environmental issues, but nobody's really talking about that. I think that's an example of the kind of thing that Chesterton was talking about. That because there's no blood and guts at the moment, nobody's talking about it. So we tried to highlight issues that the media ignored, like demography, like the family, the importance of personal virtue, the degradation of sexuality, neglect of spiritual values, and so on, but always trying to draw from headlines. As I think Carl said something about using current events to promote a spiritual message. So that was what we're trying to do pretty consistently. Chesterton's distributism was solidly based upon the family. And to quote again from G.K.'s Weekly, the world around us has accepted a social system which denies the family. It will sometimes help the child in spite of the family, the mother in spite of the family, the grandfather in spite of the family. It will not help the family. I think that's as true today as it was when it was written, probably even more so. Our public policy is not supporting the family as a unit, because we have a highly individualistic political culture. Mercator was constantly banging on about the family, and we were always calling for a family audit of public policy. So our philosophy, our philosophy, we called Chesterton called his distributism, we called ours dignitarianism. So a neologism which is probably just as opaque as distributism. But this is what Mercator stands for, reframing ethical and policy debates in terms of human dignity, not dollars and cents or political calculation. We place the person at the center of media debates about popular culture, the family, sexuality, bioethics, religion, and law. Mercator isn't liberal, it isn't conservative. We don't want to be trapped on one side or other of the culture wars. If you want a label, try dignitarian. Okay, so that's another version of that. No clickbait, just real issues. Well, I did try to have a lot of clickbait, actually, but you need... dignity is a very contested word nowadays. I first discovered how... I thought dignity would be a universally acceptable sort of cover for our efforts. But fairly early on, after we started publishing, I received a letter saying that, well, thank you very much, very admirable, and so on. But you say there something that about we appeal to all men and women of good faith, whatever, and note this, please, only men and only women, nothing in between. So I thought that was pretty bland, really. And I got a letter somebody saying this is very hurtful to people who have intersex conditions and so on. So but that's very familiar to us today. But at the time, I was very puzzled by that. I'd never heard of intersex conditions or transgenderism and so on. So I thought, well, okay. So I deleted that sentence. Okay, if somebody feels hurt by that, it wasn't. But later on, I discovered how sinister it was, really. Well, dignity is very contested. There are various philosophical subtleties which I've tried to understand and failed. Maybe some of you went to a book launch recently by Jim Franklin, who's he may have spoken here at some stage. He wrote a book on the meaning of dignity, and very thick, and I didn't understand a word of what he was talking about. But he's a sort of defender of Kantian dignity. But there's also Aristotelian dignity and Christian dignity and scholastic dignity and so on. But the word dignity has also become a shibboleth of the LGBTQI plus lobby, with whom we often differed. But what was clear to me was that some people, particularly Peter Singer, he's the best known of this, denied vehemently that there's such a thing as dignity at all. And in fact, in the bioethics area, which I wrote about quite a bit, you couldn't use the word dignity. That was, if you used it, you'd be ridiculed, or you just wouldn't be published at all. They regarded human dignity as sort of highfalutin baggage smuggled in from religion, which can and should be discarded. notion of dignity was either too vague to be meaningful, or it simply restated other notions, such as respect for autonomy, individualism, or capacity for rational thought. Most of these people were utilitarians, and well, we had a lot of fun attacking them. One of my best columns was about Peter Singer. Anyway, Carol and I are Catholics, but we wanted a sort of omnibus word which would allow us to frame arguments based upon natural law without resorting to the authority of Catholic magisterium. Now, I think dignitarian worked pretty well. Our readers detected it and appreciated it, and we had a lot of fairly serious Protestant scholars who contributed to Mercator because they thought, well, I feel comfortable here. You know, I'm framing my arguments in terms of more biblically, but it fits into what Michael's publishing. So, but our rule of thumb was that we ignored religious stories unless they had appeared on page 1 of the New York Times. Perhaps there's another similarity in this to Chesterton. Dale Alquist, he was a Chesterton scholar, he observed about the GK's Weekly. Though it was not a religious publication, Chesterton never shied away from religious questions when they were raised, but he strove to make his appeal for social justice as broad as possible, since he certainly felt that Catholic social teaching is for the benefit of the entire society, not just for Catholics. So that's more or less what we thought. So we did publish a number of Catholic stories. I thought Pope Francis was hard done by in some of the media, Catholic media, and I admired him, so I wrote about that. And Cardinal Pell's travails, we published quite a few articles about defending Cardinal Pell, and the sex abuse scandal, which is ongoing in public schools and is being ignored. But I think they're of general interest. All told, we must have published about 15,000 articles, of which about 1,500 carry my byline. We had hundreds of contributors, partly because we sought out some good Creative Commons pieces. Creative Commons is most of our articles were Creative Commons. It's a legal arrangement by which you can publish, you can freely republish an article or an image or a music in the interest of sharing it widely. We tried to ensure that the writing was sharp and entertaining and also covered the main stories in the news. That's where I learned how to become an expert in 20 minutes on Gaza or Ukraine and so on. People liked our product. This is when we closed up shop, of course, I got a few protests from people who said you shouldn't shut down and so on, but a few nice words, from Singapore, one of the best publications I've ever come across, beacon of sanity and reassurance. And you have to take these with a grain of salt, of course. People are always very complimentary when you're dead. But an editor in San Francisco, and I was touched by this because there's an editor of the Catholic paper, as in San Francisco, who says, well, I've been reading for 20 years, sorry, they never, as a Catholic trying to live by faith and raise my family in a crooked world. So, from New Zealand, our children have a far more strongly developed sense for us, for the truth as a result. One thing I learned as editor of Mercator, we did have these ideals of projecting truth and projecting a respect for human dignity from conception to death and so on. But it's nice to see people grasping that. Anyway, But I'd like to say the most popular article of our 2 decades, by a long shot, wasn't something very trenchant that Carol and I wrote about the family or LGBT issues or the sex abuse crisis. It was a review of Amazon's The Rings of Power. That got about 100,000 hits in a day, you know. And our website almost crashed, you know. But, a typical article, Mercator, I got about 1,000 hits. I'm just trying to learn some lessons from this for anybody here or any acquaintances of yours who would like to launch a magazine somehow resembling Mercator, Mercator.net. I think one deficiency was unavoidable, I suppose, but was lack of reporting. Our op-eds, I think, could hold up anywhere. The Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian, or the New York Times, for that matter. You know. But we seldom had any scoops or shoe leather journalism, getting out on the street and bringing news to the wider media, and because the mainstream media they're constantly surveying what they smaller journals like Mercator and so on, looking for news, and you need to do that, I think, to keep up. So if it was so good and so popular, why did it fire? Well, for the same reason that GK's Weekly crashed, I think lack of money and lack of marketing. So our business plan was simple, and I still think it's convincing, but if on average, so most people will give nothing when we sent out constant, desperate pleas for, your plea for money always has to be desperate, and there has to be a countdown. In 10 days we're going to close unless around Christmas time, so when you go back home now and check your emails, you'll start to receive these desperate pleas with a countdown to December 31st or whatever. But so we did get some big donations, 10,000, 5,000 at a hit. Most people gave nothing. But if on average subscribers gave $2, with 100,000 subscribers, you'd have an income stream of 2,000, and then philanthropists with deep pockets would realize that they were backing a winner, and they prop it up even further with other donations. Very simple, very easy. But it was simple, but it didn't work. Because you need to get up to that 100,000 mark. And unfortunately, we got it up to about 15,000 or so. But I wasn't very good at marketing. I guess my expertise is in semicolons and proofreading. So as we improved our product, other entrants came into the online opinion space, and there was an ever-growing competition for eyeballs. And perhaps we were too vanilla when the market was looking for jalapenos. So, but look, I think it can be done, and that's the, I suppose, the optimistic message that I have. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so my favorite example is this lady here, Barry Weiss. So let me tell you a bit about her. I'm not putting her up as a successor to Mercator. She is divorced and married lesbian, as an IVF child, and so in a lot of ways quite different, But she has a lot of wonderful qualities, which I'll outline. But quite a few people have succeeded. Well, there's Joe Rogan. I suppose everybody knows Joe Rogan, and there's quite not quite a few, but a handful of other podcasters or contributors to Substack. There's one woman called Heather Cox Richardson, who is a history professor at Boston College in Boston. And she is a quintessential East Coast American liberal. But she writes 1,000 words every single day telling her readers what a disaster Trump is. And she has millions of readers. So it can be done. John Anderson here, the former deputy PM, he has a wonderful podcast, YouTube interviews. But anyway, Barry Weiss, so she was very pro-Israel and anti-cancel culture, otherwise fairly progressive, but she was solidly in favor of free speech and of defending Israel as a beacon of democracy in the Middle East and so on. And she's Jewish. But this ended up putting her on the losing side of a civil war at the New York Times. Her co-workers protested against her and basically forced her out. Well, she didn't throw her toys out of the cart and so on. She write a bitter memoir about my time at the New York Times. She started up a Substack called the Free Press, which is really quite interesting. So this is today's Free Press, but you can see there's her formula. So she wrote a couple of articles herself, but she managed to draw in quite a few other people. These bylines won't be familiar to you, nor to me, but she's managed to get Tyler Cohen, Niall Ferguson, and quite a few other people who are very well known in the media, who tend to be a bit conservative, or centre-right, I suppose we'd call it here in Australia. But and she supports a kind of God bless America vibe. She's pro-Israel, and she supports, God bless her, a growing interest in religion amongst American young people. There's article after article about how people are rediscovering their Catholicism, their Judaism, their Presbyterianism, and so on. So she assails wokeness, and she's featured some great sort of shoe leather journalism, people going out on the road talking to impoverished Americans around the country and so on. And so, the other day, she sold the Free Press to Paramount. Paramount is being bought out by Larry Ellison and his son David, and they're becoming a new media company in the States. She sold it to them for $150 million. So, and as part of the deal, she was appointed the editor-in-chief of CBS News, which is big in the United States. It's a little bit of trouble, but still quite big. So people have accused her of selling up to the establishment. Well, all I can say about that is I wish somebody had tempted me. Because you never appreciate how much your treasured principles are worth until you can price them on the open market. I would have sold up for a lot less. But so, it can be done. So the secret of success, well, idealism is not enough. Good intention is not enough. You need friends with deep pockets. I think that's a business friend with deep pockets, because I think business people bring to, even if they're not interested in your writing, never read a word of it, but they know it's good for other people, they bring a good business sense to it. And a good business plan, agile internet marketing. I mean, the internet is changing all the time, all the time. Well, not from day to day, but from month to month almost. For instance, Barry Weiss's The Free Press was on Substack. So Substack is a new platform that people can use for what used to be called blogging, but it works best for long-form essays. And after people settled into it, and people like this Heather Cox Richardson started publishing long-form essays, they opened it up to the layout and so on. It's very rigid, the layout, but they opened it up to kind of newsy look, which was a bit like what I displayed for you. And it cost nothing, zero, right? It cost nothing, you know. So we were spending thousands of dollars on an expensive platform, which was quite good, but it was costly. And then suddenly, a new platform comes out which costs nothing, and it undercuts you. Or different types of marketing. For instance, when we started out, we spent a lot of time working on Facebook and Twitter, trying to maximize our reach through Facebook and Twitter. But then we discovered that, Twitter's was for a certain kind of market, which very few people who go on Twitter would be interested in Mercator, right? And then Facebook kept changing its rules and so on. It was a good platform, but the demographic was increasingly older, And so there are a lot of problems with Facebook. It's still useful, very useful, but you have to be very, very clever at how you use it. Contacts. So you get people to, and then solid traditional journalism. You still need to know how to write good headlines, write good prose, and so on. So perhaps if Chesterton had followed my advice, he would still would have been here. So, but there is another option. I recently, although Mercator is still is sort of there in archive form, but I still get occasional letters. So this is from my friend in Nigeria. I'm Dr. Spiritual Intercessor. I can cast a spell on your behalf regarding relationship, financial situation, future events, or whatever is important. And can all be done in 1 to 7 days. Privacy, strictly confidential. So I'll give you a moment, you can copy down the WhatsApp number if you like. So with that, that was Chesterton's 10th birthday issue in the year before it ended. But anyway, very, very cute there. And perhaps we can just close with a couple of his aphorisms. Journalism largely consists of saying Lord Jones is dead to people who never knew that Lord Jones was alive. I find that every day, especially about Hollywood figures. I don't pay enough attention to Hollywood. And, I was at where I'm working now a couple of days a week, Catholic Weekly, and one of the girls there was just, oh no. She was talking about Katy Perry is dating Justin Trudeau. Is it? Yeah, no, Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau, yeah. So I didn't know who Katy Perry was. Anyway, journalism is popular, mainly it's fiction. Life is one thing and newspaper another. When we announce on flaring posters that a man has fallen off the scaffolding, we do not announce on flaring posters that a man has not fallen off the scaffolding. Yet this fact is more exciting, more than the moving tower of terror mystery. Anyway, that's sort of typical Chesterton, and really it kind of sums up his philosophy that the most beautiful thing about the world is it's essential is that God has given it goodness and order. Thank you very much. Any questions, comments?
Yes, we'll need to take a break very shortly, but please, we can have one or two
Simeon,
questions.
yeah.
David?
Thanks, Michael. I've always been interested in how it's all working out. Mercator is such a valuable source for so long. How do you think Colette's making a go as an Aussie homegrown online publication?
Which one?
Colette.
Oh, Colette. Ah, yes. Okay. Now, sorry. You're quite right there. I should have mentioned maybe she would have been a better example than Barry Weiss because she's homegrown. Well, I think she's that line I mentioned there of contacts. She's obviously a woman with a lot of verve, a lot of guts, and a lot of contacts. And so she's struck a vein of intelligent, progressive conservatism, you know, which. So I don't know too much about her, but she's attracted some, I think, donations, and she's hired people, put people on to look after her marketing and her social media and so on. So I don't know too much, but I really admire what she's done. Yeah. Tim? Yeah.
Michael, you didn't touch on it, I think, the times we're in terms of the sheer volume of high quality distraction for everybody, including everyone here, I'm sure,
Yeah.
let alone young generations who don't seem to read anything. What do you want to say about that? Like your quality of journalism, content rich, somewhat delayed in terms of the immediacy of news, but contemplative, dare I say.
Yeah.
How do you get that through to?
Yeah, well, that's a $64,000 question. I think I would have been better. Probably should have kind of tried to contact the mainstream media more, and get a few headline contributors. I mean, it has some very competent contributors. One of the people who was a consistent contributor, very well known in her sphere, was Margot Somerville, who's a professor of bioethics at Notre Dame at the moment. But she's, everybody in her space knew her, but nobody at the Sydney Morning Herald did. I think you need to attract people through that. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what to say about that really. But you have to pay attention more to getting your name in the mainstream media, and that will lift the whole thing.
Mike, you touched on something, a tension that all of us feel if we're trying to weigh into public argument, as to what extent we declare our theory of life that underlies our conclusions. You mentioned Peter Singer. He's free to be openly, transparently clear on his theory of the non-existence of anything transcendent, the non-existence of, and therefore. It's all completely consistent, and therefore has the contempt for, as you say, sneaking in arguments about God. Now, are we almost at the point in our culture where the idea of God is becoming so strange, so exotic and almost novel, because it's been so absent for so long, that we'll be able to come back in with the same fresh declaration of a theory as Singer is with his atheism? But we'll be able to come back in not relying on magisterial declarations, but getting back to Aquinas's 5 ways, or Lewis's argument from reason, or Newman's argument from conscience, or things that are almost part of natural law, or certainly part of reason, and come in at that level and say, because we think this is actually true, because we think this is actually the case, just as Singer thinks it's not, therefore these things flow from it. And then we won't be hiding the assumptions behind our writing. It'll be open.
Yeah, well, actually, Greg Sheridan is going to speak this afternoon, right? That's the burden of all of his writing, I think, really, And I think he's a good example of someone who has, put his heart on his sleeve and has succeeded. And I agree with you. It's very difficult to say, well, I'm a Christian, and this is, I like to argue this particular policy. But I think it's becoming more and more plausible gradually. And but I think you do have to stick to a natural law perspective on things, because I think, like Peter Singer, it simply doesn't relate to all of human experience. You know, I mean, everybody's longing for transcendence. Peter Singer says, no, you're not longing for transcendence. You have toothache. You know, you know. But I mean, that's patently not true, and everybody realizes that. But it does take a while to convince people of it. At the moment, in this climate, unfortunately, I'm a bit more optimistic than you, but it is a great difficulty.
Thank you, Michael. I think we better take a pause at this stage. There will be a panel discussion in the final session, so if you do have any questions, apart from Peter, you might raise with Michael informally, please feel free to do that. I was very intrigued by the quotes of Chesterton's with the good news. And I remember this British satirical program called The Frost Report in the 1960s, had Ronnie Barker giving speeches in most of the episodes, and he always looked tremendously solemn, and anyhow, he was giving the BBC Night Bulletin, which was good news, and he said, the first item is that there were no nuclear explosions in Wales overnight. This brings Wales into line with the rest of the world. The oldest man in Scotland, Mr. Angus McPhee, who turned 112 last week, is still alive. And then he said, and now a message for shipping. And that was all that he could find to report of the goodness in the world. Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Yes.